This episode is brought to you by my 10-week Fertility Awareness Mastery Group program. If you're listening in real time, registration for my January 2018 groups is now open. To reserve your spot today, make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program. That's fertilityfriday.com/group program. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 170. Welcome to the 170th episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I'm really excited to be here with you today. I have a special episode for you. I was thinking about what should I talk about today? What should today's podcast episode be? And what I decided on is I thought that it would be a really great idea to talk about some of the biggest challenges that most of my clients face when they're starting to learn fertility awareness and starting to apply it to their daily lives. So I'm really excited to bring this special episode to you today. And also just a note for those of you who are brand new to the show, or for those of you who are seasoned charters but still have some questions and struggles about fertility awareness charting, I want to invite you to jump in and join my 10-week Fertility Awareness Mastery Group program. And so if you're listening in real time, it is November of 2017, and registration is open for my next 10-week program. So this is a program that I only run a couple of times a year, and essentially the purpose of the program is to really help you gain confidence. By the end of the program, you are just at a completely different level in terms of your confidence with fertility awareness charting, your insight into the connection between your cycle and your overall health. And also you get the opportunity to really have a window into the charts of all of the other women who are part of the group. And so for more information, make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program. Make sure to jump over there and apply sooner than later. I will be closing registration mid-December just to make sure that we're all ready and set to go for our first sessions in January. So again, that's fertilityfriday.com/group program. And so now I want to jump into today's episode, and the topic of the day is the 5 biggest challenges when it comes to adopting fertility awareness into your own life. And so what I'm going to do is go down in descending order. So I'm going to start with the challenges that I feel are all very valid and very important, but I wanted to kind of end with what I feel is the most significant challenge. So I suppose I'm trying to add a little bit of drama to the episode, although it's not at all dramatic. But yeah, so I'll be talking about the 5 biggest challenges. So the first challenge, and maybe even before I jump into this, I just want to preface it and say that what's interesting about fertility awareness, for those of you who have been charting, and especially for those of you who've been charting for quite some time. So I know some of the listeners have been charting for years, maybe like 2, 3, 4 years. So the longer you chart, the longer that you get in there and are recording your signs and really get a sense of what is happening in your cycle, the more that it feels like second nature, the more that it just feels like you're not thinking about it, you're not doing it. Even if you tried not to pay attention to your signs, you wouldn't be able to not notice. So for instance, even if I tried not to pay attention to what's happening in my body, I have been charting for so long that I can't even not see it. I will always know where I am in my cycle. there's no other option. I always know where I am in my cycle, even if I'm not particularly trying to pay attention. And so because of that, it feels so second nature. One of the comments that I often get is like, how did I not know this before? Like, now that I know this, I can't even imagine not knowing it. And so it's interesting because in many ways, charting is really simple and straightforward, but it's kind of the same. I love the analogy of, comparing charting to learning how to drive a standard car or even an automatic car, but I drive a standard car. So at first it was hard. Like you watch someone doing it and it seems like there's so much going on, but it really took a little bit of practice. But once you do it, then it's like so easy. You don't even have to think about it. So it's the very same thing. So even though it is easy, once you get the hang of it, there are certain things and certain rules and certain specialized aspects about this charting method that you really need to get down and understand fully in order to be successful in using the method as successfully, particularly when you're using the method for birth control so that you actually get that true effectiveness. So studies have shown that this method, the symptothermal method, so when you're paying attention to your cervical mucus and your temperature, has been shown to be up to 99.6% effective. But in that particular study that I'm quoting, the women in the study had specifically been trained by educators who were trained, so educators who were certified to teach others, and they were also following the method. So they were trained by someone who knew what they were talking about, and they were following the method. So even though it's really easy and really straightforward once you get the hang of it, there is a bit of a learning curve, and it for the best results you really want to be trained by somebody who knows what they're doing. And so with that being said, just to kind of get our feet wet, now I want to go into the 5 biggest challenges when it comes to making fertility awareness a part of your life. So the first challenge that I want to throw up there, so this is a challenge that not every single woman faces, but the essence of this challenge is something that women face. And so this is the variability of your menstrual cycle. And in particular, I'm just going to throw out the example of when you've recently come off of hormonal birth control. So any of my longtime listeners will know that on the podcast, we've talked a lot about hormonal birth control and the different side effects associated with it, and also the different ways that it can affect your cycle. And so I've done a number of episodes specifically on the effects of hormonal birth control and also that transition phase. So the one thing to know about hormonal birth control, whether it's a pill that you're taking, or whether it's an IUD with hormones, or like a shot, or an implant, whatever type of hormonal birth control that you're taking, and even fertility treatments. We've talked a little bit about those, but any type of hormonal contraception or hormonal type of fertility treatment, there's a transition phase, what I refer to as a transition phase between when you discontinue the use of it and you transition back to your natural cycle. So when you're paying attention to more than just when your period comes, and so when you're paying attention to total cycle length, but also you're paying attention to the quality of your pre-ovulatory phase, you're paying attention to your mucus cycle, paying attention to your temperatures, paying attention to your post-ovulatory phase, and any type of irregular bleeding and spotting. So when you're actually paying attention to your cycle in its entirety and looking at all of the different factors that would make a cycle normal or not, so if it falls into the normal parameters, all things considered, what you'll find is that when you've come off of hormonal contraceptives recently, it takes some time before those parameters will normalize. And so there are things you can do during that period of time to support your body to detoxify and get rid of some of those hormones and really just start to see your natural healthy patterns emerge. But one of the challenges for women who are then wanting to jump in and start using fertility awareness is that when you've come off of hormonal contraceptives recently, there is a higher degree of variability in your cycle than there would otherwise be had you not been taking them, assuming that you're healthy and you don't have any type of endocrine issues going on. And so one of the biggest challenges then for women who are trying to adopt the fertility awareness method, especially if they're coming off of hormonal birth control after long-term use, is that when you're reading the resources about fertility awareness and learning about what the cycle is supposed to be like, those resources are explaining to you what a normal healthy cycle is supposed to look like. And so a normal healthy cycle for a woman in the middle of her reproductive years is a lot different than what you typically see post-birth control. So for a woman in the midst of her reproductive years who has not been on hormonal birth control, her cycles are going to be, and of course, assuming that she's healthy and she doesn't have any significant endocrine disorders or other challenges that are otherwise throwing off her cycles are going to be pretty consistent. She's going to have a pretty, I wouldn't say predictable pattern, but I would say like a fairly well established pattern. So by no means do women have the exact same cycle over and over again. There is variability in the cycle. Even for women who have a very quote unquote regular cycle, there is still variability and they're still susceptible to different changes from stress and illness or travel or whatever might come up for her. But with that being said, a woman of reproductive age who has not been on hormonal contraceptives, she can be fairly certain that her cycles would be pretty consistent. But for someone who's just come off of hormonal birth control, she may have extended days of mucus. She may have no days of mucus. She may have delayed ovulation. She may have what's called a double peak, where it looks like her body's about to approach ovulation and she's got mucus, and then the mucus pulls back and then she doesn't actually ovulate. And then she has another round of mucus. And perhaps this time she actually does go on to ovulate, but it might throw her off because she's ovulating later in the cycle than she normally would. So those are all complexities that make it a little bit more challenging, especially when you're first starting out to chart. And so those are the situations where you really, really benefit from having the support of somebody who can guide you through that. So, the bottom line is that you can chart your cycles and reliably use the fertility awareness method, regardless of what your cycle is doing. So regardless of whether your mucus patterns are not quote unquote normal, regardless of whether you have a double ovulation, regardless of whether you have a super long cycle or a super short cycle or, anything in between. But the key is being prepared for it and really understanding how to kind of gauge day by day if you're fertile or not. So one of the second, I'll say that, the second challenge in terms of incorporating fertility awareness into your life is really getting into the habit of charting. I think for a lot of women, that is a really big challenge. It feels very daunting to think that this is something I have to do every day. Like I have to check my temperature every day. I have to check my mucus every day. And just the idea of getting into that habit, or literally trying to figure out how to incorporate that habit into your day-to-day life, that's a big challenge for a lot of women, especially when their lives are crazy and they've got stuff going on. And so I think for a lot of women, that's like a really big challenge in terms of incorporating this into your life. I think there's a lot of women who assume that because it requires this daily observation and recording of the observation, that maybe it wouldn't work for them. But the interesting thing about it is that it's kind of like any other habit. So in terms of checking for mucus, for example, what I always say to my clients and in my groups is that, well, when you go to the bathroom, you're wiping anyways. So I don't have to tell anyone to wipe. I know everyone who's listening who's female, every time you go to the bathroom, you wipe yourself. So essentially adding the additional layer of checking on purpose with intention every time you go to the bathroom, for example, we're just layering a habit on a habit that you already have. So although it can seem really daunting, it isn't actually daunting. And it's simply a habit that if you're able to get in the habit of doing something, for any of you, if any of you floss your teeth, so I'm hoping that many of you do. But for me, I know I didn't always floss my teeth. I didn't floss my teeth when I was younger, but eventually I adopted that habit. And so it's not like this big deal that oh my gosh, I have to floss my teeth. Now I can't really go to bed without flossing my teeth, because if I don't floss my teeth, it feels really weird. I can feel the stuff between my teeth. So it's simply part of building the habit. But I know for a lot of women, that's a pretty big challenge. So, checking for mucus is one thing. Checking your temperature in the morning, again, that's something that for a lot of women feels kind of daunting. And obviously with temperature, it varies depending on how much sleep you get and all those types of things. So I feel like for a lot of women, ultimately, my experience has been that it's really mind over matter. And so because I've worked with so many women over the past couple of years, often what I'm providing for them is a bit of a push, a bit of accountability. And really, as soon as they have me in their corner cheering for them and supporting them and showing them the best practices of how to do these things and sharing all of the different tricks and tips that I've gleaned over the years from speaking to so many different women, really and truly, it's just not that hard. So ultimately, although it seems daunting and you can kind of like dwell on that, like, oh, this is so much work, when you actually do the action of taking your temperature first thing in the morning or checking for mucus when you go to the bathroom throughout the day, it's really just not that big of a deal. And it's something that it takes a second. And the key is actually just doing it for long enough. So committing to doing it for, say, 30 days or something like that for the full cycle, just so that long enough that you can get into the habit. And then once you get into the habit, you don't really have to think about it. It just happens. But I know that that's a big challenge for a lot of women. In addition to the challenge of getting into the habit of it, I would say the third big challenge around incorporating fertility awareness into your life is being consistent with it. So actually not just checking, but being consistent regardless of what's happening in your life. And I think that's the biggest challenge, because things are always going to come up. As someone who's charted their cycles for so long, I've charted my cycles for the better part of my adult life. So for the past 16 years now, it's there's things that always are going to come up. You're going to go on a vacation. Someone's going to get married. You're going to have to, something's going to come up at work. Maybe there's a family emergency and all of a sudden you're not sleeping as well as you usually would, or whatever the case. But there's things that come up, and that makes it hard to stay consistent with it. And for a lot of women, that makes them question whether or not they'll be able to rely on the method, especially if they're looking at the method for birth control. And so, there's a couple things that I say about that. The first thing is basically what we talked about before, which is getting into the habit. Once you're in the habit of something, even when life is a little bit crazy, you may not be as on top of it, but you still do it. So you still are in the habit. So for instance, even if I'm not intentionally doing something, it's hard for me to go to the bathroom without actually checking for mucus, because it's just it's something that I just can't not notice. So because I'm in there anyways, and because I've done it for so many years, it's even if there's a lot of stuff going on, I'm still going to notice where I'm at in my cycle, because it's just a part of my day. And so I suppose the more practical thought for consistency is what happens when, even if you're checking, you kind of fall off the wagon with actually recording it. And so you go several days without writing anything down. And that makes it really hard to kind of remember what was going on. Because ultimately, if you're not writing it down, it's really, there's just no way that you're going to accurately remember what happened every day for the last 5 days. So I think that the biggest takeaway is that, first of all, to forgive yourself. I mean, that's just evidence that you're a human being. If you forget a couple of days to write things down or to chart or check, you're a human being, and that's just confirmation of that. The key is not to get discouraged and not to throw out everything that you've done. So the key is just to kind of like, all right, I forgot the last couple of days. Now I'm going to jump right back on the wagon and start charting again. And so that's the challenge. The challenge in staying consistent. It's more the mind game of just forgiving yourself and moving on, and not really thinking that it's like such a big deal, just kind of going with the flow. So it's making this method fit into your life. It's finding ways to acknowledge that life there's going to be ups and downs. Sometimes it's going to be a little bit easier. Sometimes things are going to be a little bit more stable. Sometimes there's going to be challenges that come up, and that's going to make it a little bit harder for you to stick with it. But at the end of the day, you can always recommit. So you can always just, instead of making a big deal of it, oh my goodness, I didn't chart this week, I was so busy, and thinking, and now just, giving it all up altogether, what you can do is just, but I have my tissue paper here today, so I'm just going to record what I see today and just jump right back in there. So number 4, I would say, is basal body temperature charting. I think especially for new charters, even in the Facebook group that I host for the Fertility Friday community, one of the questions I see in there, just in various ways, and a lot of discussion happens around it, is the basal body temperature charting. And actually, at the time of this recording, there was some interesting discussion around temperature going on today. There's different methods of fertility awareness, and I know that there are methods of fertility awareness that actually just tell you not to take your temperature, or just, it's just mucus only. So the interesting thing about the method that I teach, so, I've been trained in the Justice method, and with that method, you can use the method with mucus only. It's based on the foundations of Billings, and it's based on the foundations of Cretan. And these are two methods that don't use temperature. And, they use mucus as the main marker. And so what's interesting about the Justice method is that, the mucus actually is the primary sign, and you can chart without temperature and pay attention to your mucus only. And I have definitely done that. It's in certain periods of my life, specifically in the postpartum period when I've in the midst of breastfeeding. And I've done that twice, because both cases, my ovulation and menstruation didn't return for many months postpartum, closer to the between the 8 to 12 month mark that I went before I actually ovulated and my cycle resumed. So for me, during that 8 to 12 months, doesn't make sense for me to chart my temperature when I'm not ovulating. So it's worth noting that although some methods don't require temperature and other methods do, I have always found it to be extremely helpful for women, especially when they're first learning. Because what I find when women are first learning to chart, they need a chart or two to get the hang of the mucus. So they need to get the hang of the mucus observations to really get comfortable with categorizing their mucus with all the different types of mucus and all the different categories, and how to record it all, and the sensation and the different variations that can happen. So I find that with temperature, especially for a brand new charter, it really, really helps because then you're able to take these two signs and use them both to corroborate and to determine when ovulation is happening in the cycle, to be quite clear and confident about where the luteal phase is in the cycle. And so I would say that the option of charting with mucus only is often helpful with more experienced charters who have several charts under their belts and are really, really comfortable and confident identifying mucus. But with that being said, temperature definitely presents a number of challenges. So there's so many women who have just challenging schedules. So whether it's that they work throughout the night, sometimes they're on the night shift, whether they have variations in when they wake up in the morning, there's just so many variations with temperature, and that is one of the challenges for a lot of women. The interesting thing about temperature is that temperature is quite reliable once you get the hang of it. So if you're able to take your temperatures consistently, if you make sure that you note any abnormalities in your wake up times or any abnormalities in your day-to-day life, there's a lot of things that can affect a temperature, whether it's alcohol consumption or allergies or food sensitivities. There's just a lot of different things that can actually show up and affect temperature. But even with that said, all of the clients who I work with, even if they have certain challenges with temperature taking, we can typically overcome those with some best practices with temperature taking. So that's one of the challenges. And there's lots of information on the internet about how to take your temperature, and I think that it confuses a lot of women. There's a lot of information about, you have to get up at the same time every day. And so I've talked to women who get up at, 4:30 on a Saturday to try to be consistent with their temperatures. And ultimately, one of the biggest challenges with charting is incorporating it into your life. Charting shouldn't be this additional burden that you add to your already complicated life. And so finding ways to just incorporate charting into your life, I feel like that is the best practice. So when I'm working with clients, I'm just helping them to incorporate all of this stuff into their life. And if that means that some days you're getting up a little earlier, some days you're getting up a little bit later, sometimes your schedule is a little bit complicated, it doesn't mean that we have to impose these crazy wake up times and things like that to make this happen. It can also mean that we're just making really good notes on the chart and being really clear on how to interpret them to make sure that we can get that temperature as accurate as possible. And also the great thing about the method that I teach is that if you do have a situation where the temperatures are totally out to lunch, you can always rely on mucus because mucus is the primary sign anyways. So with that being said, basal body temperature charting comes with its own challenges. And for many women, it's kind of a big deal in terms of how challenging it is for them. But the good news is that there's a lot of things you can do to overcome that and just to find a way to make it work into your own life. I would say, though, that by far the biggest challenge for women who are just starting to incorporate the fertility awareness method is cervical mucus. I would say that is number one. That is the number one reason that experienced charters join my programs and jump in and work with me. Women who've been charting for quite some time, but still have never really just got the mucus down. So just to really fully understand it, to be able to be really clear on which days are fertile, which days are not, what is a dry day and versus all the other days, and how to really just incorporate that into their day-to-day and be really confident using the method for whatever their intentions are. And so that is one of the biggest challenges. And I think there's a number of reasons for this. I mean, when it comes to cervical mucus, a lot of the resources out there are a little bit vague about how to chart mucus and often, draw mucus into these broad categories. So for instance, like sticky, creamy egg white. I think I've talked about that on the show quite a bit. I mean, for a lot of women, it's really just too broad. And so what I like about the method that I teach is that actually it's based on the Cretan system. So Thomas Hilgers developed what he termed the vaginal discharge reading system, or vaginal discharge recording system, I think it's called. And so essentially what he did is he broke down mucus into all these different categories by color, by the amount it stretches, and color, consistency, and how much it stretches, what the sensation is when you're wiping. And so essentially I always joke that it's everything that could possibly come out of your vagina is listed on that system. And so it brings you to a higher level of effectiveness in terms of reading and understanding and interpreting your mucus such that you can be really confident about what you're seeing. So I guess the bottom line with the mucus, especially if you found it to be challenging for yourself when you've been trying to incorporate the fertility awareness method is that there are different methods of fertility awareness charting that make mucus really easy. So it is possible for mucus to just be really simple and straightforward, but it does take that additional step of having someone to support you through it and to really just help you understand it. So some women don't have any problems with it. There's a lot of women, I think, who would hear all of the intricacies about fertility awareness and the challenges that their women go through in terms of figuring out their cycles and think like, why is it so hard? It's been so easy for me. There are women who are able to just kind of pick up a book and figure it out on their own. And often those women have fairly straightforward cycles. In the work that I do, I have to refer to women who've never used hormonal birth control. I'll call their cycles virgin cycles. And essentially, I've seen it. When women haven't used hormonal birth control, often their cycles are a bit different and in many ways easier to read and interpret. There's just less variation. There's just less things that happen. If you are listening to the show and you've always had a pretty straightforward cycle, it's like your period and then you have dry days and then you have a few days of mucus and then the mucus goes away when you ovulate. And then, about 12 days later, you get your period. And it's always kind of like that, then it may be kind of like, well, why is it so challenging for some women and not others? And so what I find is that mucus is literally the biggest challenge for most women when they're learning the fertility awareness method. And often just because of the confusion around like, what is it? How do I categorize it? How do I tell the difference between this type of mucus and that type of mucus? How do I know if I'm having mucus versus if I'm having a different type of fluid, like arousal fluid or all those types of things? And ultimately, that is why it is the biggest challenge. But the good news is that it's easy to overcome. And so with a little bit of support, most of the women that I work with are able to kind of really get their heads around it and feel quite confident about the charting within about 2 to 3 cycles, 3 on the long end, usually closer to about 2 cycles, within about 2 full cycles where you've had it like a clear ovulation and a period and then kind of going in again, having mucus, ovulation, and then having your period, the full kind of gamut. When you have that experience, it typically only takes about 1 to 2 cycles to get really confident about it. So to wrap it all up, what I've been talking about today are the 5 biggest challenges for incorporating fertility awareness into your day-to-day life. And so, the first challenge that I wanted to talk about was birth control, essentially charting when your cycle is variable. And so, the example that I gave was for women who have recently come off of birth control because there's that transition period where their cycles are highly variable. But there's a number of other situations where cycles can vary and charting can be challenging as well. So another example would be post-miscarriage. It's common for the first cycle or 2 after miscarriage to be variable, to be a bit different to what you would expect your cycles to be like. Also for women who are struggling with endocrine challenges. So we've talked a lot on the podcast about PCOS and thyroid disorders, for example. And if a woman is struggling with PCOS symptoms, often her ovulation may be more sporadic. If a woman is struggling with thyroid dysfunction, she might find that her ovulation is a little bit delayed regularly. And ultimately what this leads to is more cycle variability. And so I think the biggest challenge then for women who have those cycle variabilities is getting out of that habit that we've all been taught that our cycles are supposed to be predictable. And so it's something that really and truly, I feel like I just support my clients in deprogramming. We're deprogramming all those years of being taught that our cycles are 28 days long, because I find that women find comfort and reassurance in having predictable cycles because we have been trained to believe that our cycles are supposed to be predictable. And so one of my main messages, especially as I'm working with clients and in the groups, is that even though you may start to notice patterns, and I encourage my clients to look for patterns. So you look for patterns so that you get a sense of what your cycles are typically like. Although you will see patterns, you cannot use that history as a way to guess what is going to happen next cycle, because every cycle is unique and every cycle has the potential to be different from the cycle before. For example, if you've always ovulated around day 18 or 19 of your cycle and you've been charting your cycle for 3 years, it doesn't mean that this cycle you couldn't ovulate on day 10. Like I've seen it happen. And so for me, I have the benefit of seeing thousands of charts and seeing different cycle variations and seeing things that it's hard to convey, regardless of how regular your cycles are, regardless of how many times you've seen a certain pattern. It does not guarantee that your next cycle is going to follow that pattern. So I think that in a nutshell is kind of breaking down the challenge of having a cycle that varies. Because in order to really use fertility awareness when your cycle is varying, even for my clients that have fairly quote unquote consistent or regular cycles, they still see variation. So even for women who have really regular cycles, there's still variation there. And so I think one of the biggest challenges when I talk about that challenge of varying cycles is actually getting out of that rhythm method thinking. So thinking like, okay, my cycle is always going to be this way and my ovulation is always going to happen this time, to really jumping into the fertility awareness mindset. And so the mindset of fertility awareness is one where you're not assuming anything. You're literally looking at, you're observing. You're taking your observations each day. You're observing your mucus patterns. You're observing your temperatures. For many of my clients, they'll choose to observe their cervical position as well, although it's an optional sign. And so at the end of every day, you're able to look at your observations and decide if you're fertile or not based on what you saw that day. And so that is a totally different mindset, because ultimately when you're coming from that fertility awareness mindset, it doesn't matter what happened last month or what happened, what's been happening for the past 3 years, because what you really understand is that what determines if you're fertile or not is essentially, what's happening that day, whether or not you have mucus, whether or not you're in your fertile window. And whether you are in your fertile window or not, it has nothing to do with when you ovulated last cycle. It has everything to do with whether or not you're observing cervical mucus today. So that's one of the challenges. And of course, another big challenge, as we talked about, is getting into the habit of charting. So really just nailing down that habit to begin with. The third challenge being to stay consistent with it. So, developing the habit is a challenge for a lot of women, but then staying with it, keeping with it, staying consistent. So staying consistent with both your observations and your recording of it, even when life gives you a curveball. So I think those are some really big challenges for a lot of my clients. And of course, we talked about basal body temperature charting because of all the different variations that can come up. And the biggest challenge being cervical mucus, because there's just so many different variations. There's so much information out there. And much of the information leaves women just really confused because of these kind of vague definitions of what the different categories of mucus are. I suppose it kind of goes along with everything I've been talking about already, but for women whose cycles fall outside of normal parameters. So for women whose cycles they don't fall into the healthy, normal patterns. For women who have different health challenges, that's a challenge. I think what's really important to note about these things is I have had so many situations from my client work where I reflect back and I think about if I'm working with a client, I've worked with a number of clients where different health issues will come out specifically because of something that we've seen on their chart. And what I often wonder, I don't have an answer even to this day, is, if they hadn't been charting, would they have discovered this? When would they have discovered this? How much worse would this, thing have to get before it would have come to their attention in other ways? There's so many situations where, for instance, women who've been charting their cycles will notice a change in their cervical mucus and be able to identify precancerous, cervical cells, or women who are charting their cycles and notice that their temperatures are out of line and it helps them to diagnose a thyroid issue, or women who are charting their cycles and notice that their ovulation is a little too variable and are able to identify PCOS or other different types of issues that arise. Women who are charting their cycles and discover that there's certain foods that they're sensitive to based on what they see in their charts. And so I'm often left with that question of, it's really powerful stuff. And unless you're paying attention to it, you're not going to notice it. And so there's been so many times where, even though the chart itself is not quote unquote perfect, we've got all these challenges and there's all this variability and perhaps the mucus patterns are out of line and we've got bleeding that's irregular or whatever the case is. Even if the cycle is a hot mess, so important to have the ability to chart, because having the ability to chart and look at it, that's giving us that first window into what's going on. And that allows us, it gives us the power to actually do something about it and to actually try to get to the bottom of it and figure out what it means. And only when we do that can we really start to get in there and to correct things. And so I've seen amazing things. I've seen charts, completely reverse. So, you come in one way and your chart looks this way, and we're seeing all these different fluctuations and variations. And by the time we're finishing up our work together, we're looking at a totally different chart. We're looking at a totally different cycle. And, just that process of really getting in there and really using the cycle as a diagnostic tool, really understanding how the cycle relates to your overall health and what information you can glean from your cycle. That is really what puts the power back into our hands to help us improve our fertility naturally, to help us optimize the chances of getting pregnant if we're trying to conceive, to help us identify which days are fertile so that we can avoid those days for unprotected sex if we're, trying to avoid pregnancy. And so my overarching message is that, if you really want to make the fertility awareness method work for you, if you really want to use this method as your primary birth control, if you really want to switch from using hormonal contraceptives to using a natural method, I just want to tell you that it's possible. So there's no method that's right for every woman. Fertility awareness isn't going to be right for every single woman, and especially at different points in her life. There might be certain points in her life where it's the perfect fit, and there may be some points in her life where, it really isn't the best thing. But I just want you to know that it is possible. Thousands, if not millions of women are able to, take control and take charge of their fertility, if you'll pardon the pun, obviously giving a nod to Toni Weschler's book, Taking Charge of Your Fertility. But so many women will, take the reins and sort this out and learn how to figure out what's happening in their bodies and use that as a way to avoid pregnancy without hormones, without anything. And so it is possible. And even though there are challenges, because this is something that involves us changing our behavior. So this is something that involves you learning new skills. It involves you developing new habits. It involves you doing certain things consistently and making observations and recording them and all of that, learning something new. It involves, buying some books, reading up about it, and often taking a course or a class, working with a professional just to make sure that you've really got it and you can be really confident. As I record this, I just wrapped up my most recent 10-week group program. And at the very end of one of the sessions, one of the women in the group, she made a comment about how she was so excited to have been part of the group because she realized, she's like, this is something that I can use for the rest of my life. And she's like, even if I have kind of like a crappy month and I forget to chart or I do something, I still have the information and I can still just start the next day and start recording again. And she's like, this is something I'm going to have forever. And it just brought me so much joy when she said that, because that's how I've always felt. I learned this method so young. I was 19 when I learned about the fertility awareness method, and I am now 34, and I have literally had this throughout my whole life. And so it's something that I learned, and it's something that I mastered. And I was so fortunate to live in Edmonton, Alberta, when I was learning, and I was able to learn from women who really knew what they were doing. I was able to learn from professional educators. And so throughout the years, this is something that I've always had. And like I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, even if I wanted to try to ignore my signs, or I couldn't, because it's just a part of me now. And so I always know where I am in my cycle. I always know what's going on because it's just a part of me. It's just how I roll. So you can have the same thing. I'm not some magical person. It's just a skill like any other skill. And so with the right support, you can get to the point where it's just like anything else. It's like brushing your teeth or riding a bike or driving a standard car. If you drive standard, you can just take it for granted and go through your life and totally get your menstrual cycle and be able to use that knowledge as a way to prevent pregnancy without relying on any type of external birth control, which is really freeing. Yeah, it's really freeing to be able to do that. So with all that being said, I'm going to wrap up this episode. So I just want to thank you so much for, hanging out with me today. And yeah, like I said, I was really excited to share with you just some thoughts on some of those challenges. I'd love to hear your opinions on it. And so when I air this episode, I will be creating a thread in the Facebook group because I want to hear from you. What are some of the challenges that you faced? What was the biggest challenge for you if you've adopted the fertility awareness method, or if you're thinking about it but a little bit scared to actually make the switch over? What is the biggest thing that's holding you back? Is it the fear of that you're, of course I'm going to get pregnant right away and I won't be able to do it, it won't work for me? Or is it something more granular, like I'm trying to figure out my mucus and I'm having a really hard time? So if you are not part of the Facebook group, make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/community for your invitation to join us in the Fertility Friday Facebook community. And I want to hear what your biggest challenges have been with fertility awareness. For those of you who have either made the leap and you're charting your cycles, or if you're thinking about making the leap and you're really wanting some support, some guidance from someone who has a lot of experience and who can really just get down to all the nitty-gritty details with you, I want to invite you to be part of my 10-week fertility awareness mastery group program. I mentioned it at the top of the show as well. You can head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program and apply there. We will be starting 2018 strong, and I would love to have you in the group. So make sure to head over to that page, fertilityfriday.com/group program, and get in your application so you can join us. So it's really nice to be able to share this knowledge and information with you. The feedback that I always get from my audience, from you, the listeners, is that this information has not been as readily available to you as you would have liked it to be. I receive emails on a regular basis from women who've just discovered the podcast and literally getting the download of a lifetime because, they're well into their adult years. And this is the first time they're learning really about how their body works. And so, with the 10-week fertility awareness mastery group program, it just gives you an opportunity to dive in like head first and get the brain dump. Like for you to it's the accelerator tool. So instead of having to fumble through and figure it out over the next 6 to 8 months, you can just jump into a 10-week program. And by the end of the program, you're going to be good to go. You're going to be ready to roll and really confident in using this method. And for the rest of your life, you'll just have it. So I'd love to see you in there. Thank you so much for taking the time and listening to the show today. I really appreciate all of you for listening to the show, for supporting the show. I appreciate all of you for spreading the word, sharing the show with your friends. This show has been steadily growing over the past 3 years, and it's in large part because of all of you who are out there sharing the show with your friends and just spreading the word. Ultimately, the more that I do this work and the more women that I work with, the more women in the Fertility Friday community who I work with in my different programs and one-on-one, the more of you that I connect with in my fertility awareness reality series, in the pill reality series, the more email communications, the more I connect with you in the Fertility Friday Facebook community. Honestly, I just feel more and more and more driven and determined to try to make this information available to women because there's such a need for it. That's what I hear from you. I hear from you that we really need this, and more women need to have the opportunity to learn how their body works and to be able to make those informed choices. So I really appreciate you for being part of this community. I always say, this started out as, me knowing that I had knowledge that most women don't have and feeling a responsibility to share it. And so 3 years in, it's incredible to see where we've come. And I'm excited to see where we'll be in the next 3 years and what will happen in the future. I really think that the more women that learn fertility awareness and the more women that become acquainted with this knowledge, I think the world is going to be a lot different. So thank you so much for being part of this with me. And as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.